I'm going to tell you about the moment I watched my older brother realize, in real time, sitting across a conference room table, that the man who had just acquired his failing company was the same man our family had spent 15 years calling a waste of potential. I want to tell it slowly, because I've waited a long time to tell it at all, and I think the details matter. My name isn't important here, so call me Reed. I grew up in a suburb outside Charlotte, North Carolina, the younger of two brothers in a family that measured worth almost exclusively in terms of visible, conventional achievement. My father was a mid-level executive at a regional bank, the kind of man who kept a laminated copy of his own resume in a drawer like a religious relic, and my mother was a former teacher who had opinions, strong ones, about what a successful life was supposed to look like. And those opinions had exactly one acceptable shape: a four-year degree from a respected university, a corporate job with a title that sounded impressive at dinner parties, a house in a good school district, and children who would repeat the cycle. My brother Aaron was 3 years older than me and fit that mold like it had been cast around him. He went to a solid state university on a partial academic scholarship, majored in finance, and by 24 had a job at a regional investment firm that my parents could describe to relatives using words like portfolio and assets under management with visible pride. He was, by every metric my family cared about, exactly what a son was supposed to become. I was not. I dropped out of college after my second year. I want to be honest about why, because the real reason matters more than the story my family told about it for over a decade. I didn't drop out because I was struggling, or because I was partying too much, or because I lacked discipline, which was the narrative that calcified in my family within about 6 months and never once got updated with new information. I dropped out because I had started building a small software tool in my dorm room, something to help independent freelancers track invoices and estimated taxes, and within one semester, that tool had more paying users than I could keep up with while also attending classes. I made a calculated bet on myself. I told my parents the truth, or what I thought was the truth at the time, that I was taking a leave of absence to pursue a business opportunity, and I remember my mother's exact response, which I have never forgotten. "So you're throwing away your future to sell an app to college kids?" It wasn't an app, and it wasn't for college kids, but details like that were never really the point. The point had already been decided. I was the son who quit. Aaron was the son who finished. That framework got set within the first year, and it never moved again, not once, not even as the actual facts on the ground shifted dramatically over the following decade. I'm not going to walk you through every step of building a company, because that's not really what this story is about, but I'll give you the shape of it. The invoicing tool grew slowly for the first 2 years, profitable but small, just me and eventually one contractor. Then I pivoted into a broader financial infrastructure product for small businesses, the unglamorous, unsexy plumbing that nobody talks about at parties, but that thousands of companies quietly depend on every single day. By the time I was 28, I had 11 employees and a business that was profitable enough that I hadn't taken a traditional paycheck in years because I didn't need to. By the time I was 32, I had 60 employees and turned down 2 acquisition offers because I believed, correctly as it turned out, that the company was worth significantly more than what was being offered. None of this registered with my family because I made a decision early on, somewhere around year 3, to simply stop trying to correct the narrative. I want to explain why, because I think it's the part of this story people find hardest to understand. It wasn't spite, not at first, it was exhaustion. Every time I mentioned anything about my work at a family dinner, the response was some version of polite, distracted humoring, the kind of nod you give a child describing a dream they had.
My mother would ask about Aaron's promotions in detail, follow-up questions, genuine engagement. When I mentioned hiring my 15th employee, my father said, "That's nice, still doing the computer thing?" and then turned the conversation back to Aaron's recent bonus. At some point, I stopped correcting them, and then at some point after that, I started actively managing what information reached them. I kept my house modest and my car older than it needed to be. When asked what I did for work, I said something vague about consulting on small business software, which was technically true and revealed nothing. I did this, I'll admit, partly for protection and partly, if I'm honest with myself, out of something colder. I wanted to see how long the story would hold up against zero new evidence to support it. I wanted to know if my family's opinion of me was actually based on anything real, or if it was simply a story they'd decided once and never bothered to revisit. The answer, it turned out, was the second one. For 15 years, at every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering, I was introduced to new acquaintances with some variation of, "This is my younger son, he does something with computers," and "This is Aaron, he's a VP at Ketterman Financial." I sat through 15 years of my achievements being treated as a mild eccentricity, while my brother's achievements were treated as the family's central proof of its own success. I want to be clear that Aaron himself was rarely cruel about it directly. He wasn't a villain twirling a mustache. He was simply a man who had absorbed the family story about the two of us so completely that he never thought to question it. And in some ways, that passive acceptance stung more than active cruelty would have. The company I built is called Ledgerway. I'm not going to pretend that's not a real name, because I want this story to feel concrete, even if I'm keeping other details vague. By the time I was 36, Ledgerway had grown into a mid-sized fintech company with a valuation north of $400 million, a real, audited, board-verified number, not a founder's optimistic guess. We had begun doing selective acquisitions of smaller firms whose technology or client relationships complemented our own, and it was through this acquisition arm that Ketterman Financial's name first crossed my desk.
Ketterman had been struggling for 2 years by that point, badly enough that it wasn't public knowledge yet, but badly enough that their board had quietly begun looking for a buyer rather than let the situation become public and cratering to their remaining clients. My head of acquisitions brought me the file without knowing anything about my personal history with the company, because there was no reason for her to know. I had never once mentioned Aaron's employer by name to anyone at Ledgerway. I sat with that file for 3 full days before doing anything with it. I want to be honest about my internal state during those 3 days, because I think it's more complicated than a simple revenge fantasy, even though revenge fantasy is clearly part of it. I thought about walking away from the deal entirely, letting some other firm acquire Ketterman, because some part of me worried that pursuing it made me smaller somehow, made this about my family instead of about sound business strategy. But when I actually looked at the numbers, the deal made genuine sense, independent of any personal history. Ketterman had a client book in a geographic region we'd been trying to break into for 2 years, and their remaining talent, minus the leadership that had run the company into the ground, was genuinely strong. It was, by every objective measure my team could produce, a good acquisition. So I'd let it proceed. And I made one decision that I will admit unambiguously was personal rather than strategic. I chose to be present for the final negotiation meeting myself, in person, something I rarely did for acquisitions of this size, because I had a very good team who handled that work more efficiently than I could. I told my team I wanted to be there for this one because it was in a market I cared about personally. That was, technically, not a lie. The meeting took place in a conference room in Charlotte, 6 months before I'm writing this. I walked in with my head of acquisitions and our lead counsel.
On the other side of the table sat Ketterman's remaining leadership, their outside counsel, and 3 of their senior VPs whose positions were on the line, depending on how the transition went, one of whom was my brother. I watched Aaron's face when I walked in. For the first 2 or 3 seconds, there was nothing, no recognition of anything unusual, just the polite, neutral expression of a man in a business meeting. Then his eyes actually landed on my face, and the neutral expression didn't so much fall as simply stop functioning, like a program that had hit an input it had no instructions for. "Read?" he said, and it wasn't a greeting, it was a question, an actual question, as though he needed me to confirm that reality was doing what it appeared to be doing. I nodded and said, "Good to see you, Aaron," in the same tone I'd use with any professional acquaintance, and then I sat down and let my head of acquisitions begin the meeting. I have thought many times since about what was happening behind Aaron's face during that meeting, because he did an admirable job, to his credit, of holding his composure through most of it. But I could see him recalculating in real time, could see him running back through 15 years of dinner table conversations and holiday cards and offhand comments about the computer thing, trying to figure out where the story had diverged from the facts and when. The meeting itself took 90 minutes, and I said very little beyond what was strategically necessary, letting my team handle the substance, because I hadn't come there to gloat, or at least that's what I told myself, though I recognize now that simply being present and visible was its own form of message, quieter than gloating, but not actually all that different underneath. Afterward, Aaron caught me in the hallway. He asked, in a voice that had lost most of his professional polish, how long I'd had all this, gesturing vaguely as though my entire company could be captured in a hand motion. I told him the truth. 15 years, give or take, building steadily the whole time, no secret windfall, no lucky break, just compounding effort that had simply never been visible to anyone in our family, because nobody had ever asked a real question about my life for 15 years. He didn't have a response to that. I don't think there is a good one. The aftermath within my family has been slower and messier than the meeting itself, in the way that these things always are. My mother, when she found out, and she did find out because these things don't stay contained, called me not to apologize, but to ask, with what I can only describe as genuine confusion rather than remorse, why I hadn't just told them so they could have been proud of me sooner, as though her failure to ever ask a real question about my life over 15 years was a detail too minor to acknowledge. My father, to his credit, was quieter about it, and I think somewhere underneath his silence there was something closer to actual shame, though he's never said so directly, and I don't expect him to. Aaron kept his job through the transition, actually, which some people find surprising when I tell this story. I made sure of that personally, and I want to explain why, because I think it matters. This was never about wanting to destroy my brother. Aaron didn't build the family's story about the two of us. He simply never questioned it, which is a different and lesser failing. He's a competent VP, genuinely good at parts of his job, and punishing him professionally for our parents' narrow definition of success would have made me exactly the kind of small, vindictive person I'd spent 15 years quietly refusing to become. Watching Aaron's face in that conference room was, I'll admit, worth to me more than any financial outcome of the deal itself, but I didn't need to take anything else from him beyond that moment of recalibration. Our relationship since has been strange, tentative, neither fully repaired nor fully broken. We've had 2 real conversations since that meeting, actual conversations, not performances for our parents' benefit, and in both of them, Aaron has said some version of the same thing, that he never meant to make me feel small, that he genuinely believed the story our parents told because it was easier than questioning it, that he's sorry in a way he clearly means, even if the apology arrives 15 years later than it would have mattered most. I believe he's sorry. I'm not sure it changes very much. Some doors, once they close, don't reopen just because someone eventually knocks on the right side of them. I don't know how to end this story cleanly because it hasn't really ended. I still see my parents a handful of times a year. My mother still, occasionally, in an unguarded moment, refers to my company as the computer thing, not out of malice at this point, but out of a kind of habit so deep that it's become load-bearing, a story she's told herself for so long that even overwhelming evidence to the contrary can't fully dislodge it. I've stopped correcting her. There's a version of me from 15 years ago who would have found that infuriating. The version of me now mostly just finds it sad, in a distant sort of way, the way you might feel sad about a house you used to live in that's since been torn down. What I keep coming back to when I think about that conference room is not the satisfaction of the moment itself, though I won't pretend that wasn't real. It's the 15 years underneath it. All the dinners and holidays where I sat quietly while a story about me that had nothing to do with my actual life got repeated as settled fact. I think about how easy it would have been for someone to simply ask a second question at any point along the way, and how that single small habit, curiosity extended even slightly past the first assumption, might have changed the whole shape of this story. Nobody did. And so I built something enormous in the space that indifference left open, quietly, for 15 years, until it was too large to misunderstand any longer.